Good afternoon, everybody, to today's second webinar session in the series on human rights and environmental due diligence in supply chains. We are still waiting for a couple of people to come in. We have more than 100 registrations actually for today's session, and in the meantime, maybe we can already do a quick introduction of us as the speakers and also talk about the webinar series, the whole program, and also, of course, about today's webinar. So my name is Mareike Brandt. I'm working for the Southern African German Chamber of Commerce and Industry based in Johannesburg. I had the Competence Center for Sourcing, and together with my colleagues from Germany that I will present shortly, we have organized this webinar series for you. This webinar series is actually part of a bigger program. You might have read this already. We had our first session about 2 weeks ago talking about the introduction to this whole topic of human rights and environmental due diligence. You can find the recording. If you haven't seen it in the invitations that were sent out, you will find it on the website of my competence center. I will share the contact details later on. Today, 9th of October, obviously, we are going to talk about strategic integration of due diligence into your business, into your work, and also how to conduct a risk analysis. And again, in another 2 weeks' time, but this time Thursday afternoon, 24th of October, 2:30 to 4 p.m., we will then talk about preventative measures, remedies, and complaints procedures. You can find the link here once more. I will also put that in the chat in a little while. And we have the great pleasure of having another external speaker with us for that webinar. It will be Ms. Sarah Schnurbusch from DHG, and they are sourcing charcoal actually from Namibia and already have much experience in working with their Namibian partners and how to implement human rights and environmental due diligence according to the German legislation that is in place. So she will share her insights on these topics in 2 weeks' time. And then I mentioned this is only part one of a training, of a whole training program, of a whole program for potential and current suppliers to Germany and to the European Union. So coming November, we will have a more of a deep dive and in-depth training on this topic of human rights and environmental due diligence. You can see the date here. It's starting on the 7th of November. And then we will actually also have a third part. So for everybody that has done both the webinar series and the program in November, we can then also have an alumni event to discuss basically the outcome of this whole training and support and coaching that you will have gotten by that point. So just some organizational remarks. You can already probably see that this session is being recorded until the Q&A section. So because we want to give all of us a bit of room to ask questions as openly as possible. So there are no silly questions, no stupid questions. Post them in the chat, whatever you are wondering about. We are happy to answer them here live if we can, and if we can't answer, we'll get back to you after the webinar. This session will be about 90 minutes long. The presentation will also be shared, the recording will be shared. And if you have any technical issues, please let us know in the chat as well. Usually it helps to once exit and then rejoin the session. But if anything persists, do let us know. So with not that much further ado, I would like to introduce today's speakers. As I mentioned, my colleagues from the help desk of on business and human rights. First of all, we have with us Miss Jenny Ohme. If you haven't been here for the first session, just maybe 1 or 2 sentences of introduction about Jenny. She is a political scientist by background, has actually spent many years of her life in South Africa already, and she has been with the Help Desk on Business and Human Rights since October 2017, so it's been 7 years already, and she currently works there as the coordinator and actually as part of the management team. So welcome, Jenny. Pleasure to have you back. And then we also have with us Dr. Jana Heinze. She's a social scientist who's also been working on this topic of business and human rights actually already since 2011, and with somewhat of a focus on minerals and the automotive sector. And she's currently working as an external advisor for the Help Desk on Business and Human Rights. And with that, I will stop talking and actually hand over to Jenny. Jenny, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mareike, for this very kind introduction. I'm very happy to see so many participants again for this second part of our 3-part webinar series. Very happy to continue the dialogue with you in the course of this webinar today. Now, I'm sure that many of you as participants have already participated at the first webinar already, but I heard that there's also a few newcomers who did not participate yet. And Mareike already mentioned the fact that we do have a recording of the first webinar. If you do not have the link to the recording yet, I'm sure she's very happy to provide it to you. And of course, I would like to invite you to have a look at the first webinar if you are interested to look at it in your own time. Before I start, I would like to give a brief recap actually of the content that we touched upon at the last webinar, because it did provide a bit of a basis for what we are speaking about today. So last time we spoke about the different legislative developments that are happening here in Germany currently, as well as on the EU level around the topic of sustainable supply chain management. And we specifically spoke about the German Supply Chain Act, as well as the upcoming EU Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. And we gave an overview of what this means for the companies that fall directly under the scope of these legislations, which are mainly German companies, as well as then in the future other European companies, the types of processes they have to implement by law. But we also spoke about the indirect effect this has then for their suppliers that might also be present in other parts of this world, including, for instance, in Southern Africa. So we spoke about the implications of these legislative developments for companies that might be exporting to the German market or to the European market, as well as the type of requests that they might expect from their buyers, as they are interested about the types of ESG management system that companies have in place, or the types of standards that they are implementing. So this is what we touched upon last time. Now, what will happen today? Today, we will focus on the concrete implementation of human rights due diligence processes. And we will specifically focus on how companies can strategically integrate. Sorry, this is not the presentation yet. I'm not there yet. If you could perhaps close it before we start, that would be great. Thank you. So we will speak today about the strategic integration of human rights due diligence processes in your own company, and how you can conduct a risk analysis, which is the best basis for the implementation of human rights due diligence processes. Now, we actually speak to German companies on how they can implement such processes every day, and we know that it is challenging, but we also know that it is possible. And today we try to give you the tools at hand to understand how you can get started on this topic, as well as touching on the topic of who to get on board if you wish to conduct a human rights risk analysis in your company, and how you can then conduct such a risk analysis, not just for your own business operations, but also for your supply chains. And we also have a case study with us today that we would like to go through together with you. And then after that, I will briefly also show you a few online tools that we have available completely free of charge that also might help you as you conduct such a risk analysis as well. Now, before I hand over to my colleague Jana Heinze, who will talk about all of these issues, I would actually like to briefly refer to a very practical example to show the relevance of risk analysis, of conducting a risk analysis, and why it makes sense to do so also from a business point of view. And the example that I would actually like to refer to is Marikana. Now, as many participants here today, I believe, are from South Africa, I am sure that Marikana is a keyword that a lot of you know of to refer to the protests that were happening at the Lonmin Platinum Mine in Marikana in 2012. And this, of course, erupted because of low working conditions and low wages that were paid to miners, that then led to protests, which then also led to the death of around 34 miners at the hand of police forces. Now, actually, when this was happening, I was in South Africa. I studied politics at the University of Pretoria. And I remember that back then, the discussions we were having around Marikana were very much focused on the responsibility of the workers at the mine, as well as the police forces and also the owners of the platinum mine as well. But when I returned to Germany, I was actually very surprised to see that even there was also discussion on Marikana and on what was happening in South Africa, but mainly also referring to the responsibility of German companies. And this is because the platinum mine that was in question was actually, 80% of the platinum that was sourced from this mine went to a German company. And the platinum was then also further used in the production of German automobiles, so the German automobile manufacturing industry. And there was a lot of German NGOs that argued that these German buyers, these German companies, should have been aware about the working conditions that were present at the mines that they were sourcing from. And so this indeed led to a very strong political debate in Germany around the responsibilities of German companies to conduct a risk analysis also for their supply chains, to be able to know about the different risks that might be present in their supply chains, and then also use their influence in order to ensure that, for instance, the workers in their supply chains are paid adequate wages and that there are no risks to their health and to their life. So this I just wanted to briefly refer to as a background as to perhaps also why we are having these legislative developments in Germany, but also in Europe, and why this is also practically relevant for German companies, why they might also approach you with questionnaires about human rights risks, and why they might also wish to work together with you as suppliers on these topics as well. And with that little background and introduction, I would now like to hand over to Jana Heinze, who will now start with the tips on how to get practically started on the implementation of a risk analysis.
Thank you very much, Jenny, and also Mareike for the nice introduction, and also warm welcome from my side. I'm really happy to be with you again. I already see like over 50 participants, so let's get started. And we're going to do a deep dive into the topic of risk analysis during this webinar. And as Jenny already mentioned, that in the light of the new legal obligations and increased requirements, German companies or European companies now must take proactive steps to ensure compliance. And by recognizing and leveraging opportunities, businesses, also like you, like suppliers, can position themselves as the supplier of choice in their industry. So I think it's time to get ready now, and you can actually be a front runner to ensure your business with European companies. Next slides, please. As I'm not in charge of the control, I think you can just click it through. I think it's animated, so it doesn't make sense. You can just click all of the bullets. So the risk analysis is a critical component of human rights due diligence, and it's guiding businesses to identify, assess, and address potential human rights impacts within their operations and supply chain. So you will hear the sentence knowing and showing quite a lot from me. It was phrased in the UN Guiding Principles by Professor John Ruggie, and it's kind of like addressing the fact to identify, assess, and address potential human rights impacts within the operations of a company. And as companies increasingly face scrutiny from regulators, consumers, and civil society, it becomes essential to proactively understand and mitigate risks related to labor rights, health and safety, discrimination, and more. You may remember, for the ones who were there during the last webinar, that we showed like different human rights that are protected via the current regulation. So it's not only the most severe human rights like bonded labor or child labor, it's also about labor rights, like the Maracana case is a perfect example for workers' rights and workers' representation, health and safety, discrimination, and more. And this process, the process of a risk analysis, involves analyzing the likelihood and the severity. Also, this is something that you should always keep in mind. In the end, it's about prioritizing your risks, and in the end, it's always about the severity of a human rights violation in specific contexts, so such as geographic regions, industries, business relationships. And it's enabling companies to prioritize their efforts and take effective preventive measures, because it takes into account that probably a lot of companies do not only have one risk in their supply chain that is completely easy to handle. A company usually have a lot of risks in a complex supply chain, and also companies will not be able to address all of the risk at the same time. So you need to prioritize. By integrating a risk analysis into your human rights due diligence, businesses can not only safeguard the rights of affected individuals, but also protect their own reputation, legal standing, and long-term sustainability. So it's really like a win-win, and that is probably also the reason why the risk analysis is at the heart of every due diligence. It's my personally, Jenny will laugh now because I always tell that during my presentation, it is my favorite core element of the human rights due diligence circle, because if you do a really good, profound risk analysis, it will help you later to identify, prioritize, take the right measures, and really have an impact on people's lives. So I think it's my favorite risk element. So when conducting human rights due diligence for you, like a supplier, the first steps typically involved assessing the rights landscape. That's like the first step. So, and I always say, like, start pragmatically and get an overview of the current state of your supply chain management. So assessing the rights landscape is all about identifying human rights risk. So understand the general human rights issues prevalent in your industry, location, in your specific business activities that you're involved in. Some industry and regions have higher risks for issues such as child labor, forced labor, unsafe working conditions. Some may not. So it's always about balancing a balanced view on your specific supply chain. Do contextual research. I think that's like the second part by start pragmatically. So study the local legal framework, the political situation, labor standards, social conditions, where the supplier or your suppliers operates to determine the most likely human rights challenges. And this also involves, and we're still like in the first bullet, start addressing human rights and environmental protection along your company's value chain. So mapping the supply chain is like one of the first thing you actually do. It's like develop a clear understanding of the operations, including sub-suppliers, as far as you know them, the parts of the supply chain that are most exposed to potential human rights violations. And this might also involve tracing inputs, labor sources, or raw materials. It's a typical example, raw materials, like think of cobalt from Congo and think about a German company like BMW or Volkswagen. Cobalt is basically integrated in all of their cars, but they have like to track down the supply chain from the headquarters in Munich deep down to the cobalt mine in Congo. Yeah. So here it's like mapping, checking what kind of products, what kind of supply chains, what kind of steps in your whole supplier networks are of a high risk. Yeah. Also there, and we are going to touch upon this point later, gather stakeholder input. You cannot know everything on your own, and sometimes paper, is very patient. I don't know how you say it like this, but it's like talk to the people, talk to your own employees, talk to the employees of your supplier, engage with workers, local communities, trade unions, civil society organizations that are familiar with the practices or the regional human rights situation. Yeah, this is also like a very important point right in the beginning. And well, the second point is about compare the requirements with your own corporate principles and check which approaches your company has already established. If you remember, like in this little repetition from last time, so make yourself familiar with the frameworks, with the regulation of your clients, yeah, so you know where they're going to approach you, but also check in-house what you already have in place, because no company starts from zero, yeah. Most of you will have policies, maybe ISO certification, health and safety management, maybe a guideline that forbids discrimination at the workplace. So you already have things in place that we can use. Yeah. So it's always good to understand the framework, like I said, the UN Guiding Principles, OECD guidelines, and currently the German Supply Chain Act and also the European regulation. Although you're not required, you do not fall under the jurisdiction, but your clients do. And that's why they approach you. And I think it's good to always make yourself familiar with the current regulation, both on the national level and as well as on the European level. So these are like two things where you can start like really pragmatically. Yeah. And these are the questions that you can ask yourself. So which stages does your company's value chain include? Is it only your company and maybe one or two suppliers? Is like in your product that you're selling, is there like raw materials? Maybe you're selling fruits or coffee or nuts, and we're going to touch upon the topic of nuts later. So like these agri supply chain. So where do these products come from? So really like tracing down the products down to the field, down to the mine, down to the production side. Who are your central suppliers? This is always part of the risk analysis. That's why maybe also German companies, European companies will approach you because you are part of their risk analysis. And you can also look back or, start to look at your own suppliers. Which processes take place in your value chain and in which countries do these processes take place? So really start pragmatically and ask yourself these questions. Next slide, please. Yeah, you can also, exactly. So maybe just keep in mind with these, start pragmatically, always keep in mind the little helicopter. Yeah, the little helicopter is something that we also like to use in presentation. Do not try to solve every little problem from the beginning. Lift yourself up a little, yeah, be like a helicopter and take a look, a broad view, and then we can drill it down and then we can narrow it down. But especially in the beginning, stay pragmatic and reduce complexity, especially if you have like very complex value chains. Most of the European companies have very, very, very complex value chains. It is not possible to identify all risks at once. Yeah, you have to be patient, you have to do your homework, but you start with an helicopter view and then you go like deeper down and drill it down into the specific risks. So always keep this little image in mind. Next slide, please. Jenny already mentioned it. There's one important part right in the beginning, yeah, to secure the management commitment, to get the internal buy-in. So it's your job basically to ensure senior leadership is committed to integrating human rights due diligence into the organization processes. Can also be like a good thing maybe to develop a human rights policy. That is also usually one of the first steps combined with the risk analysis. So to create or update a public policy that clearly states your commitment to respect human rights throughout your operations and value chains. German or European clients might ask you for this, so it's always good to have something on your desk, yeah, to show it and to be open, transparent, open for dialogue, and to develop this human rights policy. So we always recommend that in the beginning, especially for a risk analysis, gather all the important people around one table. Again, here, start pragmatically, maybe organize like a half-day workshop. And with these people, I think it's easy to identify, at least on an abstract level, the most important risks for your company. Yeah. And who should be there? Management, yeah, senior management, the CEO, to act as a leading voice to support the implementation from the start. Because you might have co-workers or colleagues in your companies that do not scream yay when they hear, oh, there's another topic that you have to address, especially within the procurement department. There's already a lot of pressure on these people. No, good prices, quality, it needs to be there within a second. So these people sometimes are a bit reluctant, yeah, when it comes to addressing these issues, and because they see it as a task that comes on top on, like, already little overworked. So it's good to have like the management to act as a leading voice and, support the implementation. Communications department is always good to also translate the strategy into a language that is understood within the company. Yeah. Also for internal trainings, for communication. Maybe you have like a newsletter or something else, announcements that you make. I think it's good to also always gather these people when it comes to the first abstract risk analysis. Ideally, of course, other departments would be included as well. Like I said, purchasing department is probably one of the most important functions for these topics. Product development, quality management as well, sustainability, human resources, sales, and works council, yeah, to bring the workforce along, especially for the workers council, but also HR, especially when it comes to wages, working hours, discriminations, very important colleagues to have on board. Yeah. So this kickoff workshop could be a starting point for your risk analysis. So you see, it's not rocket science. The risk analysis, it's not rocket science. Again, start like broad, then drill it down. Start with a workshop with the most important functions in your companies, and then address the risk accordingly with measures. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is just one quote, maybe also to to emphasize this point a little more. So convince your management of the importance of human rights along the entire value chain, not only your own company or your tier 1 suppliers, goes all the way down to, for example, raw materials for your company. Secure support and backing for the implementation, from strategic anchoring to complaint management. So today and during the next webinar, we address the topics of risk analysis and measures. And during the third webinar, we are already going to at least a little talk about complaint management as well. So these are the most important steps of the due diligence process. But with a good risk analysis, I would say you already have 60% at least. Next slide, please. So this is just a brief summary of these introduction parts, yeah, of these like how to get started before we now really like go deeper into the process of actually doing a risk analysis. So from the broad to the detailed, start strong and keep your focus. Yeah. Sometimes the risk analysis can be overwhelming, yeah, because many risks will pop up. Maybe you don't have transparency all over your supply chain. Your functions, or maybe your boss, your CEO is not really convinced that this is a good idea. Yeah? So stay strong. It will be like a journey. A risk analysis is not something that you can do, on a Monday afternoon. But again, it's also not rocket science. You have to stay pragmatically, and you already have things in place. That's why convince your management of the strategic relevance and create the conditions to revise the strategy. Start by addressing the broad view, the abstract analysis of human rights and environmental protection along your company's value chain. Compare the requirements with your own principles. Again, do the homework, what you already have in place before you, invent new measures or new tools or double work. Yeah? Check what you already have. Talk to HR, talk to the purchasing department, how they're currently working with their suppliers. Maybe they already identified risk, and same with HR. So you never start from scratch. You never start from zero. Focus on stakeholder dialogue and the inclusion of rights holders' perspective. Of course, it's easy to say, well, I think there might be a risk of child labor at some part of my supply chain. But this seems still a little too abstract in some points. Yeah? Or you check with your supplier and you ask the supplier, do you have any risk of discrimination of women? Of course, your supplier will say, no, we don't have. No, we don't have. We do not have any risk. We treat each and every one equally. If you talk to the workers or the employees, this picture might look a little different. Yeah. So it's always good to keep in mind some kind of information you may need to ask the people who are at risk. Yeah, and not only maybe the CEO of your supplier. So you really have to go a little deeper than just sending out a questionnaire with yes and no questions. Because normally they do have a tendency to say, no, everything is okay. Yeah, so it's always good to keep in mind and to focus on the stakeholder perspective as well. Next slide, please. So how to get started. So now it's really all about the risk analysis and the process of a risk analysis. Next slide. Okay, I think it's animated. You can click. So what does it mean? So a risk analysis basically is a procedure through which a company risk and violates human rights in your own business area or in the supply chain, and they need to be identified, evaluated, and prioritized. So the risks are for the people, what I said before, not for the company. We're not looking with the glasses of reputational risks. Yeah? We are focusing on the risks for the people and with a particular focus on vulnerable groups. Vulnerable groups usually are, for example, women, children, disabled people, uneducated workers maybe who don't know their rights, yeah, people who cannot read, cannot write. So these are examples of particularly vulnerable groups along the supply chain, and they need special attention during the risk analysis. Next slide, please. So what you basically do, and we use like these, like this. There's again the helicopter, it goes like from like broad to more narrow. So what we actually do is step one, identify risks. So mapping operations and supply chains. So map your operation and your supply chains to identify where your company may have a potential or actual negative impacts on human rights. So what risks does the country where I conduct business present? What risks are associated with my product? Again, like mining, if you have mining, raw materials, not only cobalt, but also tin, tantalum, whatever they're called, they, for example, bear like a high risk of child labor. Other products, for example, think of electronics, yeah, and think of a country like China or Taiwan, they do have the risk of excessive working hours, for example. So just check what risks does the country where I conduct from and what risks are associated with my product. Do not worry, you don't have to have it already in your head and just write it down. There are tools. Let me put it that way. We're going to show you one later that will help you with that. So the information is out there and there are tools that help you with. What risks, third step would be what risks are involved in the country from which I source goods, yeah? Or what components does my product contain, where do they come from, and what risks exist there? Again, think about a car, for example. There are so many different parts, yeah, of a car. The leather seats, yeah, the wheels, the battery maybe of an e-car, the battery itself, tiny little components and raw materials. Yeah. So try to, have like a mapping of your products and as far as also the components and check where they come from. Usually, the most severe risks in the human rights context lie like in the very deep supply chain, usually not in, sometimes also in the production, but usually like further away from you. So as far as possible, try to check if you get like transparent information about where the products are coming from. And then, of course, again, the question of stakeholder engagement. So again, with stakeholders, employees, suppliers, local communities, NGOs, to understand their concerns and gather insights on potential human rights risks. Because people who are at risk know their risks. Yeah? This is not something that a tool can generate. This is something where actually talking and listening is very important. Yeah. So who's potentially impacted by my business activities, both within my company, ask your own employees, talk to HR, but also throughout the supply chain. And then kind of like drilling it down, you will start with probably a lot of risks, but then the goal is ultimately to narrow it down to like certain number of risks that are manageable. Next slide, please. So again, so we already talked about that there are helpful links. I'm sorry, I think yeah, it's a little, but yeah, I think you can still read it. So which risk and violation actually occur in the own business area in the supply chain? Interview with employees, consultancy of NGOs and labor unions, information from suppliers, audits. Audits are a tool widely used in Europe with, in their supply chain of European companies, but there are also helpful links that we offer, like the risk analysis tool and also the SME Compass. Yeah, so there are two tools that can actively help to identify actual risks and violations. But you can see, I think it's always, or at least I recommend it to always have a combination of methods when it comes to identifying risks. Of course, it's completely fine to check with an online tool to get a first impression. Is this like really a product with high risk, mediate risk, or like low risk? But I think it's especially in the group of like the red products, the one that bear a lot of risks in a risky country, it's always good to get like a second opinion, a voice from the ground. So that's why I always recommend to also consult with NGOs, civil society, organizations, to, of course, talk to your suppliers. Ideally, of course, also talk to the employees of your suppliers. And when in doubt, always think about an audit, for example, to really check on the ground what is going on. Next slide, please. Yeah. We are doing a live demo later, so but just for your interest, it's also like a hyperlink here on the slide. So the CSR risk check, you can start the check there. But there's of course also other data sources that can use for the risk analysis, internal audit documents, publicly available indices, but you also have them like linked in the CSR risk check, studies, guidance, government reports, external knowledge. So there is a lot of information out there. We always recommend, I think, especially when you start, when it's your first risk analysis, use the CSR risk check as far as possible. Not all of the products are listed, but there's also kind of like a world map, at least for every country. You have like the most significant human rights risks. So I think it's a good starting tool. Yeah. Next slide, please. Yeah. So the whole exercise of risk analysis, like you say, okay, you have all of these resources, you have the CSR risk check, and now, like I said, for example, a car has a lot of risks. There's not only one, there's not only two, there's not only one producer or one supplier involved, there are many countries involved, and you do have to prioritize. I mean, there's no way around prioritization, especially because you don't have the resources in the companies to address immediately each and every risk in the supply chain. So, and here we use like two criteria. It's severity, so it's the scale of the negative human rights impacts. How severe is the human rights violation? Think about, and here we have, for example, child labor, Congo, cobalt, or we have sales, Germany, working time. Now you can already tell that one human rights violation is more severe than the others. The scale is usually very, very closely connected to the reversibility. So is the impact reversible? I mean, of course, a death of a person is not reversible. A completely stolen childhood is not reversible. Some things like bonded labor or modern slavery is not reversible. But, for example, if you are working a lot, yeah, during a peak of a project, yeah, you're working too much. You're not working the regular amount of hours. You're working 70, 80 hours a week. But then once the project is over, you get more money for that, or you get the opportunity to work less in the next 3 months. There's kind of like, it's not completely reversible, but not like a death. Yeah? So this is kind of like the the severity indicator, and of course also how many. Yeah, if a whole village gets replaced, it's of course more severe than if only one person would be replaced. Yeah, so this is something that you can have, that you can keep in mind. So it's the scale, the scope, and the reversibility. And then on the other side, it's the probability of occurrence. Yeah. So again, Congo child labor, we already know that there are a lot of problems. Unfortunately, many of these countries also have a high risk of corruption, political instability, the presence of very vulnerable groups, a lot of country risks. So this kind of like, you know, then the probability of occurrence is higher than, for example, in a country with less corruption or with more regulation or not the presence of vulnerable groups. Yeah. So you see, you have kind of like a navigator to narrow down again your risk from like a very broad view, like the helicopter view, down to, okay, but let's start with the most severe risk. This is also kind of like a rule. Yeah. The most severe human rights impacts should be addressed first. So everything that is dark gray, in this graphic should be addressed first. The other ones are not forgotten. It's not like, oh, okay, I have a child labor, and then this is like this beats all, and then I do not care about the other risk. It's more like, see it like a rolling process. So it's kind of, we start with the most severe, but then step by step, we're also going to focus on the other risks. Yeah. So this is basically what you need to know about the risk analysis. You start broad, you gather as much studies as you can, you're checking an online tool, ideally you speak with the people, and then you have like a mapping of all of your risks, and then you'll be like, okay, but where do we start? And then, take the lens of severity. I think that's like the most important part. Start with the most severe one and take it from there. Yeah, really, step by step. In the end, it's all about progress and not perfection. There is no perfect company out there. There is no perfect risk analysis. You will always have a lack of information at some point, a lack of transparency at some point, a lack of staff also at some point to, perform these risk analysis, talk to the people, talk to the suppliers, send out questionnaires. There will always be a lack of. But we should not stop there. We should focus on the things that work. And I think using the tools to get like a first overview of your risk, and then maybe start with the most severe and your direct suppliers. Yeah. Or start with the direct suppliers and try to work with him or her to go deeper down your supply chain. Start pragmatically, but start. Yeah. This is as easy as it is. Start at some point. And I think then, as it is an ongoing process, there will always be new risks because you will not always stay with the same set of suppliers. There will be new suppliers, maybe new countries. So it's kind of like an ongoing process. That's why it's also not recommendable to be like that you want to be perfect, but you want to be like good, and like the continuous improvement is the goal here. Next slide, please. Yeah. So now I have 15 minutes left, which is very good because we want to do this very hands-on and pragmatically, again, with a case study. So we wrote a little case study, and I'm going to read it out loud. And then I would like to give you 5 minutes to think about, and we're going to see that on the next slide, about the questions. And then feel free to already post your thoughts in the chat, things that pop up after what you heard now. Again, helicopter, risk, potential vulnerable groups, prioritizing. Yeah, these are all like the things to keep in mind. So you work, so put yourself in the position that you work for a South African company, Zambezi Cashews, with 100 employees in Johannesburg. Since cashew farming in South Africa is relatively small compared to other African countries, you have subsidiaries in Mozambique and Tanzania. So this is the first part. Due to the booming agriculture sector in Africa, there's a shortage of skilled labor. Local workers are increasingly being replaced by migrant workers from neighboring countries. Keep in mind here, who are potentially affected groups, migrant workers, own employees. Maybe one group is more vulnerable than the others. Who knows? Yeah. Your cashew plantations are located in the Limpopo province and border local communities. This is the thing with agriculture, yeah. You usually don't have a production hall, a production site. You're usually close to villages. In the past, there have been conflicts between local residents and workers. Again, think about potential risk, potentially affected groups. Put yourself in the shoes of the potentially affected group. In recent months, your workers, via complaint mechanism, have been complaining about skin irritations. So, your CEO wants to prepare the company for the increased requirements because you do not only sell the cashews in South Africa, you're also going to sell the cashews to a German supermarket chain. That falls under the jurisdiction of the German Supply Chain Act. And during the risk analysis from the German client, you popped up because cashews and South Africa and like the neighboring countries got like the red light in the risk analysis. So, and ask you the following questions. Next slide, please. Who are the main groups that could be affected by the activities and business relationships of Zambezi cashews? What risks might arise and how would you prioritize them? Here again, think about scale, severity. Is the effect reversible or not? What is the, so how would you prioritize them? And what information sources can you use to learn more about the risk? What pops up? Yeah, maybe ask Mareike, yeah, the local German chamber. So yeah, think about it. I would give you 5 minutes now. Again, like Mareike said, there's no right or wrong answer as it's a fictional case study. So just try to think about what you heard like during the last 30 minutes and try to really work on that case to train it. And use the chat. I think everyone is able to write something in the chat. So please feel free to post. There's a question, I think. Yeah, Mareike, please put your comments in the chat so we can. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Very good. I will give you a couple of more minutes. Yeah. I already see very good answers concerning the main groups and also what risks might arise. Maybe also the question, how would you prioritize them? as I already saw, you know, oh, I like it. Answers are coming. Yeah. So many good questions already. I like it. Very good. Very good. Now there's because the prioritization, to prioritize risk is sometimes the hardest job at the end of the risk analysis. Let's see, some of you were brave and already prioritized salary then job. Yeah. Very good. So I think maybe we can already start like a little discussion. And Jenny, Mareike, please feel free to also add your comments and ideas, because what I see in the chat is I think you all recognized who are the main groups that could be affected. So of course, both the employees of the actual cashew company, yeah, then also the split between the migrant workers and the maybe the ones with a fixed working contract, but also the communities that live close to the cashew plantations. And yeah, do I see something else? Good communities, farm workers, exactly. Working local communities. No, think this is really good. So you see here, also when it comes to the potentially affected group, there's usually not only one group. Yeah, then it would be easy. And it's not, unfortunately, it's not easy. So it's you usually have at least your own employees and the employees from the supplier or deeper down in the supply chain from the other suppliers. Sometimes, especially in the agriculture sector, you also have local communities. Yeah. And then the thing with the potentially affected and the most vulnerable groups, and I think, I don't know who mentioned it, but the working conditions and the working contracts for the migrant workers. So unfortunately, sometimes there is a gap when it comes to security, contracts, wages between migrant workers and the normal workers from the company who have a fixed working contract, and the migrant workers sometimes tend to be exploited as well from the companies because they do not have a lobby. Okay, so what risks might arise? I think also you can see here that it's only one company, it's only one product, but there are already a lot of risk. And what I particularly liked, and I would like to flag that, the comment on water. So now, that's also something we discussed during the first webinar. It's not only social aspects anymore. Also, more and more environmental impacts also play very critical role when it comes to sustainability efforts of the companies. And water, for example, if you pollute the local water, it's also the right to water of the local community might be affected. So also always keep in mind, it's not only the social aspects, especially agriculture could also be environmental aspects. And I think when it comes to the risks, yeah, you already addressed a lot of them: health risk, environmental risk, reputational risk. Yeah, not put yourself in the shoes of the potentially affected group. Yeah, so it comes more to the migrant workers, and I think you all with the chemicals on the hand. I don't know if you know, but if you harvest the cashews, if you do not wear a glove, because during the harvestation process there's a bit of a poison in the fruit, and if you do not wear your PPE, your personal protection equipment, your skin can easily get irritated because it's yep. The health issues, skin irritation, agrochemicals, PPE was mentioned. Yep, very good. Let me see if I find more. Conflict amongst labor groups. illegal employment, illegal documentation, very good. That's also the risks that are mostly associated with migrant workers. Very good. Working long hours, exactly. It's not, maybe it's not only the personal protection equipment, it can also be that they're like too long on the field. So the working hours, salary, we don't know yet. Yeah. If they get paid a decent wage, at least the local minimum wage, better a living wage. Housing, very good. I like that. Samantha, very, very good. Seasonal workers, migrant workers. Sometimes, as they're migrant workers, they do not have a home where they work, so they get like special housing. But this can also be like sometimes, yeah, be a problem. So yeah, and then safe, clean, potable water, very good. Yeah, very good. So, and also I saw like one or two of you also Rutzi, I think salary, then PPE, then job security. So, but you see, like the prioritization is in the hands of the individual working in the company doing the risk analysis. Of course, based on the criteria, but in the end, always keep in mind something that leads to death, something that leads to child labor, forced labor, bonded labor is usually in the upper right part of the graphic. Everything that goes in hand with health and safety issues also is pretty severe. Anything that is related to working hours, salary, yeah, usually in the middle, but still, yeah, can be severe, especially, for example, if you treat migrant workers completely different than your own employees. Okay, so we have prioritized, and then let us check what information sources we can use. And here we have a couple of suggestions. So internal data, exactly. Yeah. Industry reports, trends, guidelines, regulation from local and national authorities, academic research, stakeholder engagement. Again, there's no right or wrong, or like you have to read 5 studies or 5 reports, and then you can, click the box. So you have to see like how good is the information, where's the information coming from, and again, ideally backed up by stakeholder engagement. Yeah, that would always be nice. So let me see. I think this is it.
Samantha also had the tip that, for instance, when looking at water risks, you can also look, for instance, at the sources or information provided by the Department of Water Affairs, so also state agencies, state authorities that might also be able to provide very relevant information. That's very true.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, thank you very much for doing this case study with us. We now gonna show you a couple of more tools and more sources that you can use. But I mean, the case study already went very well. To be honest, sometimes German companies take way longer, and they should actually already perform risk analysis when we do case studies with them. So I think you already know what's going on, and I think you already have like a good feeling for what is important, yeah, to whom to focus on. And again, this is the last thing I'm going to say. Again, the helicopter view, start broad, then down, and always put yourself in the shoes of the potentially affected groups and analyze the risks from their perspective. Because only then you have like a real risk mapping for your company that doesn't take into account the reputational risk necessarily, but the risk for the people. And again, talk to the people, listen to the people, because they know what's best and where are their rights at risk. Yeah, thank you. Jenny, please, floor is yours. Now we're going to do a little live demonstration of our online tools.
Exactly. Yes. Thanks so much, Jana, for that overview of how to conduct an effective risk analysis. And I'm also very happy about all of the contributions to the case study already and all of the great ideas. Now, Jana already referred to a few online tools that we work with when we advise, especially German companies, on how they can implement human rights due diligence processes, how they can conduct a risk analysis. We oftentimes refer them to freely available online tools tools that might be of use to them as they implement such processes. And happy news is they are not only available in German, these online tools, but they are all also available in English, some of them also in other languages, but definitely all in English. And I'm happy now to do, to share my screen in order to show you a few of these online tools and demonstrate how you can use them. So I will now go into my screen and hope this works out. I hope that you can see this. So the first online tool that I would actually like to show you is called the SME Compass. Now, the SME Compass, as you might understand from the name, is an online tool that is specifically tailored to small and medium enterprises if they have not so many financial resources, maybe also not so much personnel to be able to implement due diligence processes, but might wish to do so anyway. This SME Compass is a great resource, and it actually consists of two different parts, and that's the Due Diligence Compass as well as the Standards Compass. Now, the first part, the Due Diligence Compass, is actually a tool that guides companies through the different steps of the due diligence process. Now you can see them here on the left-hand side. So it helps companies to develop a strategy on human rights respect as well as respect for the environment, how to perform a risk analysis, how to take action through preventive or remedial measures, how to measure and report on their activities, as well as how to manage complaints by establishing a grievance mechanism. And Jana today, for instance, spoke about the importance of getting different departments of the company on board as you start engaging on human rights due diligence. And here, for instance, you can see different questions that might be relevant for different parts of the company. So, for instance, the questions that might be asked by human resources if implementing human rights due diligence processes, or by management, or by the sales department. So this is a great resource, for instance, as you are getting into a dialogue with your colleagues from other departments when you wish to implement human rights due diligence processes in your company. Now, today we had a specific focus on the topic of risk analysis, and this tool also provides a lot of great information here on how you can conduct such risk analysis. And if you go through this information, you will see a lot of parallels to the presentation by Jana. So here you have a lot of in-depth information and a step-by-step guideline, for instance, on how to identify potential risks in your own operations and in your supply chains, as well as on identifying actual risks by really looking at your own operations, as well as getting into a dialogue with your suppliers. And there's a lot of information here. I cannot go through it all. As you can see, it is truly a very broad resource. There's also a lot of download materials available that you can see here. I will show you them to you. So for instance, there is a resource that also helps you with your risk analysis to prioritize different risks. There's a guideline on how to manage grievances effectively. There is a guideline on how to identify stakeholders and cooperation partners, and how to review your suppliers. Now you can, of course, have a look at all of these resources in your own time. The second part of the SME Compass is the so-called Standards Compass. And I remember that from our last webinar, there was actually already a lot of questions on the role of certification schemes and on standards, because of course, a lot of companies might already have certain certifications. So what is the role of them there? If you have, for instance, one of the certifications that are listed here, what does this mean for where you stand in the implementation of human rights and environmental due diligence processes? And here, this tool provides an overview of a lot of different standards. Now you see here a lot of different membership initiatives, but then there's also an overview of different certifications. You might know some of them. Maybe you as a company already are working with some of these certifications. I would be very interested to hear about your experiences there, maybe later on in the Q&A session. But you can also importantly compare different standards and certifications with each other. If you are, for instance, thinking about getting your company certified, this is a great tool that helps you decide which certification might be the right one for you. Now, the next tool that I would like to present to you is a tool that was actually also already referred to by Jana, and that is the so-called CSR risk check. And the CSR risk check is a really, really great tool as you are starting your risk analysis. And what this tool helps you to do is you can filter for different products, resources, services, or also countries, and get a list of potential risks that are associated with these categories. And the first step that you can do here, as you can see, is to select a product or service. Now you can also click on View All Products, and then you see here the different categories that you can filter for. But these are only the broad categories. You can also actually click on these categories. So for instance, vegetables and fruit. And then you can see here that you can also filter for specific fruits or vegetables if you are, if these exist, if you're working with them, if you are maybe a company from the agricultural sector or from the food sector, then you can look for different risks that are associated with all of these. Now, because we were speaking about the case of Marikana earlier, I actually wanted to use the example of platinum here. So you can also look at platinum and then, sorry. And you can see here, so there's a category here, silver, platinum, and other platinum group metals. You can click on this. You can also add more products, resources, or services, but you don't have to. You can also go to the next step, and then you can look up a country. So in this case, I will go for South Africa. Let's see here. And then you can click on go to the next step. Now you can create a user account, but you do not have to do so. There's a few advantages to doing so, but you can also continue without an account. And then you can click on viewing your results in English. And then you are immediately redirected to the display of the results, which you can also download as a PDF. And then you can find here, if you scroll down a bit, the results of the abstract risk analysis for these two different categories. So silver, platinum, and South Africa. And you see here the different categories. So for instance, we have risks that are identified in relation to fair business practices, to human rights and ethics. I will briefly scroll down here. You can see all of these different subcategories as well. There's subcategories on the topic of environment. We were speaking about water use and water availability, environment and waste. There's also a lot of categories relating to labor rights, such as child labor, discrimination in gender, and so forth. Now I will actually perhaps use the example of wage and remuneration here. And as you can see, there is a risk that is identified in relation to South Africa and silver, platinum, with information here on the fact that there are especially risks in relation to migrant workers. Now, we were already speaking about the fact that oftentimes migrant workers are more vulnerable to human rights risks because of illegal employment status that they might have. Sometimes they're not being paid the same amount of wage as national workers. They might not be able to profit from the same type of social benefits and so forth. So this is, for instance, a risk that is identified here. And importantly, there's also the source of this information listed here so that companies are able to look further into this. And there's also, importantly, some information on how to tackle this risk as well. So there's advice that companies can also use if they wish to engage with this topic. So this is just an example of how you can use the CSR risk check. Now, I know that you as participants come from a diverse range of different sectors, might also be operating in very different regions, might have supply chains into different countries. Of course, you can use the CSR risk check depending on the type of operation you have and looking for the information that you might need in order to conduct an abstract risk analysis, looking at the types of risks that might exist in your supply chain. That doesn't mean that they are definitely also existing in your supply chain, but that might, for instance, be the basis then for also conducting a dialogue with your suppliers to see whether there are indeed such risks. And then the last tool that I would like to present to you is the so-called Business and Human Rights Navigator. Now, this is actually a tool that provides a lot of information on these different human rights issues that you can see here. So for instance, working time, freedom of association, forced labor, discrimination, child labor, gender equality, occupational safety and health, migrant workers, living wage, and indigenous people. So for instance, if you are conducting a risk analysis and you see that there is, for instance, a risk in relation to migrant workers. Now, again, as an example, you can click on this and you find a lot of information around the risk that might especially be faced by migrant workers. So here on the left-hand side, you find the different types of information that you can expect. So you find definitions and legal instruments, contextual risk factors, industry-specific risk factors, considerations for the implementation of due diligence processes, as well as case studies and further guidance. So for instance, in relation to industry-specific risk factors, if you click here, you find then information about the risks that might be faced by migrant workers in different sectors. So for instance, here you can see construction. There's oftentimes risks to migrant workers in the construction sector. And there's also an example here. Some of you might know that there was a lot of risks for migrant workers when constructing the FIFA World Cup stadium in Qatar. So this is some practical information here. There's also more information on other sectors such as fashion and apparel or agricultural and fishing. A lot of information. And you can also click on case studies to see very practical and concrete examples of specific companies that have tackled this issue in their own operations or in their supply chain. So here you can, for instance, find an example from Hewlett-Packard, as well as VF Corporation. We have a lot of different examples from companies from different sectors in different regions, because oftentimes we get the question from German companies, well, how do other companies do it? Do they face the same challenges as us? And how they addressed these challenges? How have they overcome them? And then it's always great to be able to, of course, refer to practical examples that might also inspire other companies as well. So here you can also look for other practical examples. If you click here, then you can see that there are a lot of examples, also not just relating to different issues, but also, for instance, relating to different countries. So here on the left-hand side, you see the different countries that you can filter for. We're always also looking for examples from other countries as well. I will now go again for the example of South Africa. And here you can find an example of Anglo-American Platinum and how they are actively monitoring safety and health risks in their mining operations. And then you can click on it and then find the case study with some information. So those were the online tools that I wanted to share with you. Of course, we're very happy to share the links to the online tools. Perhaps we can do so now in the chat, or we can also share the information, of course, after this webinar, as we send out the presentation, and then you can have a look at these online tools in your own time. And I hope that they are going to be a helpful resource to you. And of course, we're also very happy about feedback on these online tools as well, to see how they can help you, and also tips for how we can perhaps further develop them so they can be even more helpful to you.